talking about.
I know, Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, the original Godzilla, Godzilla Raids Again. You get my gist. The Blob.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Whatever, I'm glad the music stopped. Okay, at least we're safe.
Hey, don't you have that review to do?
Oh, yeah.
How the hell did you... I don't...
Fuck? What the fuck is this? There we are. Okay. Thanks for reminding me. Time to start doing the review.
Great. Now I gotta listen to you talk to yourself for another hour. Fucking secure you. Do whatever the hell I want to do.
This is Adam Noyes of And Productions, and welcome to this episode of Ishiro Honda-thon. Once again, I've got my handy-dandy Red Bull, and today we're going to be taking a look at the cult classic, Frankenstein Conquers the World. Greatest title ever. Alright, let me just say it right now. Even just looking at the posters for the film, looking at the DVD picture, seeing clips of it on YouTube or before when it used to play on AMC, I was like, this movie, even when I was a kid, was like, this movie looks really silly and really stupid. And let me tell you what, it doesn't let down. This movie is extremely, extremely silly. There are a lot of logic leaps that are made in this film. I mean, a lot of kaiju films have some logic leaps, but this one is like really in your face about it. What this film kind of relies on is, it relies on you basically going, I accept the silliness. Now let's move on with the story. And that's kind of a problem. I mean, there's some good things to be said about that. For example, films like King Kong Escapes or Latitude Zero, for example, are really silly movies that make a lot of logic leaps. But those movies are bad. Okay, those movies are flat out bad. But I put them in the so bad it's good category. This film isn't all the way bad, okay? There are a lot of good things about this movie, but there's a lot of bad things about this movie. This movie is a very mixed bag. It's still really enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of stuff in here that makes me kind of cringe. It makes me cringe, but yet at the same time makes me go, oh, that was really good. That was really clever. This is probably one of the most mixed bag Ishiro Honda movies I have, or that I've seen. In fact, I think this is one of his most up-in-the-air films, in my opinion, of his career. I know that there's a lot of people, like, on Geeks for Geeks, I posted something advertising this review, and people were like, oh, this is the most underrated Ishiro Honda film, and people were like, this film is a masterpiece. And I can't tell if they're being sarcastic or not, but I'm going to play that they aren't. And I want to say you're going to be disappointed listening to this review. There's a lot of good stuff in this film that I intend to praise. Like with every film. If something is good, I will praise it. But there is a lot of stuff in this film that I don't like, and there's a lot of stuff in this film that I find to be very, very stupid. I've said that enough already, so let's actually get on with the review. The most interesting thing with this film, this was the first co-production with official co-production between the United States and Japan. Now, in 1964, had Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, two fantastic and amazing Godzilla films. They were released in the United States by a new company called UPA, United Picture Artists, maybe? I don't know. But anyways, that was ran by a guy by the name of Henry G. Saperstein. And Henry G. Saperstein is a fucking cool dude. If you just, like, do some research on him, he absolutely loved these movies. He didn't look at these movies as just moneymakers. Of course, he wanted to make money. He was kind of the head of a studio. Of course he needed to make money. But he loved these films. He enjoyed these films a lot. He thought they were great films. And in fact, he actually was one of the few people to actually see some of the depth in the Godzilla series, for example. For example, he loved the original Godzilla, and he understood just how much you can kind of get away with this film, and he realized that a lot of these films were full of allegory and so on and so forth. So he is a really cool guy to do. And you know what? We have him to really thank for a lot of these films being released in the United States. To list a bunch of them off, Mothra vs. Godzilla. Or Godzilla vs. The Thing. Yes, he was the one that dubbed it The Thing. Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Frankenstein Conquers the World. Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. Terror of Mechagodzilla. Look at all those films. Those are all considered like the heyday of Toho Tokusatsu films. And those were a lot of the films that we grew up on. Those were a lot of the films that, like myself, would sit down and watch them on television on AMC or TNT. We have him to specifically thank for these films being released in the United States. Though he altered the films and he kind of deviated from some of Honda's original vision, this film being a good example of that in a few cases, he did bring these films to the United States and gave them a wider audience that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But this was the first film where he actually stepped in and said, I want to work with you, Toho. I don't just want to buy the film, I want to work with you. And so it was Henry G. Saperstein who sent over the American actors for Honda to work with during this film, Invasion of the Astro Monster, and War of the Gargantuas. He sent over Nick Adams, and the reason why he sent over Nick Adams was because Nick Adams was an up-and-coming star, but we'll get to more about Nick Adams a little later. As I've stated previously, the end of 1964 was when Ishiro Honda was getting bored with giant monster movies. He was getting bored with sci-fi in general. So Tomoyuki Tanaka says, UPA, Henry G. Saperstein, wants to make a movie co-financed with us, and would you direct it? And Honda, of course, said yes, being the kind of yes man he was. And Honda didn't really want to make this film, naturally. He was tired, he was sick of this genre, and he wanted to do something different. In fact, he really wanted to make melodramas more than anything. Then Honda heard that he was going to be working with Nick Adams, who was a well-known and well-received, actually, film actor from the United States, who had just been in a very successful television show called The Rebel, and he's very good in that show. And so that actually excited Ishiro Honda. He wanted to go out there and make a film, and he was like, "Oh, well, working with an American actor, this would be new. This would be something kind of cool to do." And so he kind of then, at that point, embraced the project. And he was also captivated by working with America in general. He was used to working with simply Toho, and then the idea of actually working for Hollywood, I guess, captivated him to really make this film, and especially War of the Gargantuas. So a little bit of history, again, I've stated this before in my King Kong review, but I'll kind of go over it again here, my King Kong Escapes review, but I'll go over here it again. Toho wanted to make a Frankenstein movie for a long time. This is a well-known fact. But this is actually really interesting. I didn't realize this until I was doing some research on IMDb and stuff like that, just how badly Toho wanted to make a film and the whole chaos of everything that happened at Toho because of Frankenstein. So originally, Toho wanted to make Frankenstein vs. King Kong, which was an idea pitched by King Kong's basic creator, Willis O'Brien. And that didn't work because of a bunch of rights. There's basically a whole copyright issue that happened between, RKO, Universal, and Toho, and so that kind of fell through. And so then they were like, well, let's make a Frankenstein vs. Godzilla. Well, then they lost the rights to Frankenstein, and then all of a sudden they got the rights to Kong back, so then they basically were like, well, we got this script already written. They did. They made King Kong vs. Godzilla. They replaced Frankenstein with King Kong, and that explains why King Kong gets basically a power surge from electricity. That would make sense for Frankenstein. Doesn't really make sense with Kong, but I digress. We're not here talking about King Kong vs. Godzilla. So in 1960, there was a film directed by Ishiro Honda that I have not seen, and if I do get my hands on it, I will do a review for the movie. But there was a little film called The Human Vapor that was made that is considered by those who have seen it to be one of Ishiro Honda's greatest films ever, as well as Ishiro Honda's personal favorite film that he made. That film was very successful in Japan, though it wasn't released in the United States until 1964, and it was heavily edited. So Toho wanted to make a sequel to The Human Vapor. And that movie was supposed to kind of entail with Kumi Mizuno was going to be in it, but this was, I think, her first true kaiju movie. I think. Don't quote me on that. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But Kumi Mizuno was supposed to be in this movie. She was signed onto the movie immediately. And it was going to be called Frankenstein vs. the Human Vapor. And it revolved around Kumi Mizuno finds Frankenstein's body, right, in Germany, or how it got to Japan, I don't know. That's never That's never really explained. And she revives Frankenstein. Not Dr. Frankenstein, but the Frankenstein's monster, which is why I wish they called the monster in this film. But I digress. And that's because she wants to help Human Vapor, who is played by Tsuchiya, aka Mr. Shindo, who apparently is extremely good in that film. She wants to help him, Tsuchiya, revive his dead girlfriend who was killed at the ending of the Human Vapor. I know the plot structure of the Human Vapor. At the end of the movie, the Human Vapor's girlfriend sacrifices herself to save, in an attempt to kill Tsuchiya. Tsuchiya lives in that film and is forced to live forever, which is actually very sad and very tragic if you think about it. So Kumi Mizuno was to help, the Human Vapor revive that, and then there was going to be a war that happens, and they were going to keep Frankenstein, normal height. They were going to make, basically, this kind of feels very much like an old Universal horror film from the 40s, like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, Frankenstein meets Dracula, etc., etc., etc. That's what this feels like. But that was scrapped for some god unknown reason. So then they wanted to revamp the idea of Frankenstein versus Godzilla. And that was written by Takashi Kimura. Now, you know how much I love him. He's a very dark man, very brooding kind of man who usually wrote, a lot of the stuff. He wrote Rodan, for example. He wrote the darker Ishiro Honda films. And so Kimura was commissioned to write the script. And he did. And so he had the idea that, there's a ship, Frankenstein's heart comes over from Germany. All the stuff with Frankenstein is kept in this film. In Frankenstein Conquers the World, a lot of the stuff that is in the film dealing with Frankenstein was lifted from this abandoned script for the revamped Frankenstein vs. Godzilla. If you're following me here, there's going to be a test. And so that idea was basically that the JSDF was to revive Godzilla to kill Frankenstein, who goes on a fucking rampage. So in Kimura's original script, Godzilla was actually going to be kind of the good guy, and Frankenstein was supposed to be the villain. And of course, in Frankenstein Conquers the World, the movie that we actually got, the roles are clearly reversed. And so Kimura then was commissioned to rewrite the script and replace Godzilla with Baragon, because they had by this time released Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and were currently working on Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. So he rewrote it and put Baragon in the film. And the film has a lot of Kimura traits. The biggest one being that the giant monster is clearly the victim of human arrogance. Kimura was the believer of individuals. He did not believe in collective bodies, much like I, and he didn't trust them more than anything else. He was a big believer in individuals, and he was a very dark man who believed that humans were basically evil creatures. He was about as Freudian as you could possibly get. This film has a lot of that traits in there. There is a lot of dark things with this film. Frankenstein, the heart being turned into a mutant because of the A-bomb. That kind of whole thing, the A-bomb being humanity's arrogance, the heart being a part of humanity's arrogance, actually as a good reference to the book and the 1931 film, where Frankenstein was made by sewing together dead bodies in an attempt to revive a dead body. That is another example of humanity's arrogance gone wrong. So this is like a double-edged sword that he was playing with here. This film also had balls. Kimura had a lot of balls in his film. He wasn't afraid to blatantly say stuff. And this film, it was actually pretty ballsy because it reminded Japan only 20 years after the war ended, actually to the day, when this film was kind of being made. This film reminded Japan very well that they had at one time worked with the Nazis, what is we consider to be the most evil organization in the world, even though I don't believe it's that. I believe it's the Soviet Union. And also, this film shows us the bombing of Hiroshima. Like, it's not just talked about and then it happens. No, they actually show the bombing of Hiroshima, because that's where Frankenstein's heart is taken. Now, of course, that was stock footage from the 1961 film The Last War, but Kimura also wrote that movie, which that movie is literally about the end of the fucking world at the hands of a nuclear war. In this film, Frankenstein really is the best character. If you look at a lot of things in Kimura's script, my favorite Kimura film is hands down War of the Gargantuas, because Kimura realized that the human characters were not the focal point of the film. Kimura realized that what we cared about were the monsters, and so he gave the monsters the characters that we know and like. Much of the character stuff that is in this film, and why I say there's some good in this film, comes from Frankenstein. It comes from Frankenstein or Frankenstein's monster. I'm just going to call him Frankenstein from now on. By the way, me speaking about that, I really wished he was called something else. Because Frankenstein is the name of the doctor that made him. And they just call him Frankenstein throughout this entire film. I guess it was named after his creator, which is kind of tragic in its own right, but I just wish they called him something else. Let's actually talk about the movie. We spent enough time about behind-the-scenes shit. First off, here's the basic plot of the film. So, at the end of World War II, Germany ships the heart of Frankenstein to Japan, where they're going to put it in a soldier so that soldier would never die. But then the bombing of Hiroshima happens. Lo and behold, the scientists that are working with radiation find this feral boy who's just kind of running around the city of Hiroshima, and they discover that it's Frankenstein. So then, they capture him, and then Frankenstein starts growing at an abnormal rate. He becomes a giant fucking monster. At the same time, there's also a monster called Baragon that nobody really pays attention to, who was burrowing underground and causing all sorts of destruction and eating people. And so, what happens? Frankenstein escapes, and then goes into the woods, and then Baragon is also in the woods, and then they fight, and then everything happens, and in the end. That's the basic plot outline of the movie. Which is fucking ridiculous, but whatever. So, Frankenstein's character as a whole. So, what he starts off with, the idea of his heart being transplanted to Germany. I was going to make a movie when I was in 8th grade called War of the Monsters, I think. It was either War of the Monsters or Wrath of the Monsters, and it was to take place in Germany. I actually wrote the script. It was basically, it stole the idea from this film. So what happens here is that the opening of this film is actually really good. The first 5 minutes of this film, 5 minutes of this film are actually really good. Some of the best 5 minutes I've seen actually in a kaiju film. This doctor is playing with Frankenstein's heart and revives it, and it's beating on its own. In come the Nazis take it, and then they put it on a submarine and send it to Japan, and Japan picks it up. And so then, they bring it to the Hiroshima Science Base, where they're going to transplant that into a Japanese soldier, so that the Japanese soldier would never die, because Frankenstein's heart could never die. It just automatically regenerates itself. Well, it's really interesting to look at that. I'm like, oh, this could lead to some really cool shit. This could lead to some very interesting stuff that could become a very, very decent fucking science fiction movie. This could be on the same level as, I guess maybe The Human Vapor, or Matango, movies like that, and that's what, I'm thinking of, and unfortunately that whole idea of them transplanting that heart into a fully grown, into a soldier is just utterly fucking dropped. Literally when the bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. It's just dropped and almost completely forgotten about. And I'm like, oh, what a wasted opportunity. What a wasted opportunity to do something really fucking cool. As the film progresses, the human characters, Nick Adams, Kumi Mizuno, and the other guy, they find this feral boy. And this boy was supposed to have grown from this heart. That left me scratching my head. I was like, well, that in no way makes any logical sense, because granted, what I like about Honda is Honda tries to make things as realistic as possible, and I can tell he's trying with this film, but I can't buy that. I can't wrap my head around it. I can accept it, but I just don't buy it. It's left me asking, is how the fuck did this beating heart that was inside a metal cage suddenly grow into a boy? A fully grown boy. And Nick Adams says that this boy is Caucasian, and I'm like, that's Caucasian my ass. If you just look at pictures of Frankenstein in this film, you could clearly tell he's Asian, because he's also played by an Asian. It would have been cool if Henry G. Saperstein put up a little more money and they actually hired a Caucasian man to do it. But, and I'm not saying that the guy who plays Frankenstein did a bad job. No, the guy who plays Frankenstein, he wasn't in any other film other than this. But he did a really good job. He was very good at making expressions with his face and so on and so forth, and conveying an emotion without any words. And that takes a lot of art. Do I think this is anything like Boris Karloff's Frankenstein? Fuck no. You can't top Boris Karloff. I'm sorry. Boris Karloff brought such a great level of humanity to Frankenstein's monster that could never possibly be topped. As much as I kind of like Robert De Niro as Frankenstein's monster, he has nothing on Boris Karloff. I'm sorry. Boris Karloff will always be my favorite Frankenstein's monster. this boy does a pretty good job. Anyways, so another thing that was interesting, and why I kind of wish that they just went with this idea of transplanting the heart into the soldier, was because organ transplanting organs in Japan is kind of taboo to this day. Culture, I don't really know why it is. And so this whole idea, back in 1945 and 60s Japan, where they were very conservative over a lot of this stuff, it would have made something really cool. It would have made something really dark and really very twisted in all reality. What if this soldier went in there against his will because of the emperor? What if this soldier wanted to be, you know, the ultimate soldier and volunteered, but this heart does something to his mind and it messes up his mind and he becomes this feral guy? There's so much cool stuff that you could do with this, but it's utterly dropped. And there's my first big problem with the film, was that there's a wasted opportunity there. Speaking of something else that is dropped, Tsuchiya actually plays in this film, and he plays it was either a captain or a lieutenant on the submarine that transports Frankenstein's heart to Hiroshima. And so he's the only living survivor after the bomb is dropped who knows about Frankenstein's heart. And he oftentimes goes to the scientists to help them out. He comes into the picture of this film really twice to help out the scientists. And his character would have been really interesting, because I was very, you know, if you drop the whole idea of them transplanting the heart into a soldier, focus on him more, because there's a lot of stuff that he does in this film that I'm like, oh, you could have done so much with this character. But they didn't do it. They didn't do enough. They just kind of utterly dropped his character, and I'm like, fuck. And so he sees Frank Hart, served in World War II. So I'll honestly say it right now, he was the best goddamn human character in this film. He's the one that I felt if you just had him in a movie more, he could have done a lot. Even if he's not in a lot of the film, he could have been like a Serizawa. He could have been, well, not anywhere near as good as Serizawa, but he still could have been like that kind of presence. You know, maybe he's talked about a lot, and he kind of maybe serves something very pivotal towards the end of the film. I mean, he kind of does serve something pinnacle because he witnesses the first Baragon attack, but that's Baragon, that's not Frankenstein. I wish he played more into the Frankenstein story. And he's got a very good character, because he clearly sympathizes with Frankenstein, because he's like, it's my fault he's here. It's my fault that we played with the dead. I'm the one that brought this heart over to Japan. I'm the reason why all this shit is happening to this boy. You could have done something really good with that. And granted, they tried to do that with Kumi Mizuno's character, but we'll get into Kumi Mizuno later, but I felt like that was way too preachy. Here would have been something really, really fucking interesting and really cool if he was in the movie more, but he's not. All he really does for the rest of the film, because he's played out to be like a main character during the first 5 minutes of the film, then he's kind of dropped. He disappears for a long time and just kind of appears throughout the film for like 2 minutes at a time. And he's basically introduces Baragon, and I'm like, oh, goddamn. You really, fucking, really? That's what you're going to introduce? You're not going to play with the fact that you like Frankenstein, or the fact that you feel responsible for that? That's what you're going to play with? And I have to ask this as well, back to Frankenstein. Why the fuck would radiation cause this boy to grow gigantic? How the fuck? I mean, it makes as much sense as irradiating a dinosaur. I know. Actually, this makes less sense, because this is a fucking human being. Frankenstein is a human being. And, I mean, he's retarded like there's no tomorrow, and I'm not saying that to be offensive. I mean, he's retarded. But he's still a human being. In fact, they call him boy throughout the film. Kumi Mizuno specifically never calls Frankenstein Frankenstein. She always calls him boy. Which adds a level of humanism, too. That's the level of humanism there, I like as well. I like that. That's another Kimura and Honda trait. But anyways, back to this fucking retarded shit. How the fuck? Because it's clearly explained in the film that it's him being irradiated when he was a boy that's starting to cause him to grow gigantic. And I'm like, that makes about as much sense as saying is when you're irradiated, you turn into a melted green blob of goo that goes out and tries to dissolve other people. Wait a minute. That being said, with all those problems with Frankenstein, he still is the best character. His relationship with Kumi Mizuno specifically is pretty interesting. Kumi Mizuno comes off as a little too preachy for my liking, but the way how the actor who portrays Frankenstein plays it off is very, very well. It's kind of, I would describe it as a mother-child relationship, because though Frankenstein is a full-grown man, right, by the end of this film, he's still a child. He has the mentality of like a child. And Kumi Mizuno is very much kind of the loving mother. She's the only one that really shows any true sympathy for this monster throughout the film. It makes Frankenstein tragic as a result. Again, she never calls him Frankenstein. She always refers to him as boy. That kind of makes it sad that she was the only thing that was making something good for the existence of this child. You know, I like that. That could, if you played on that a little more, that could have been very deep as well. That could have been very, very good. In fact, they do kind of play on that in War of the Gargantuas, though it's still kind of preachy. The biggest example of their relationship is when Frankenstein escapes the prison, right, or escapes his cage. Because what happens is the news reporters come in, and the news reporters take a bunch of pictures, and the flashes scares Frankenstein, and he actually runs away more out of fear than anything else. He doesn't attack because he wants to attack, and this is another reason why I love Kimuro's scripts. Kimuro usually puts a lot of this detail into his monsters and level of humanity into his monsters, as well as Honda. So Frankenstein escapes, and he kind of goes on the offensive out of defense because he's scared. He's scared. And so what does he do, right? He's scared. What does he do? In fact, these two sequences in a film are almost perfect. Like, these two sequences are very... So after he escapes, he immediately goes to Kumi Mizuno, where Kumi Mizuno rescued him, which is right outside Kumi Mizuno's house. And he goes to see her. I mean, right now he's like 25 feet tall. But he goes to see her, and the look on his face, too, he's clearly terrified throughout the thing, and this is why I love Honda. He's terrified, and then all of a sudden he sees Kumi Mizuno. And the look on his face is one of he almost smiles. He almost smiles, and you can see his shoulders lower. And I'm like, that's really good. That's some really good stuff. This is why I love these kind of films. This is why I love, the Ishiro Honda so much. Is because there's that level of humanity with the monster that is usually lacking in a lot of American science fiction films and other films being made around this time. Gorgo, for example. Here the emotion is very in your face, and you sympathize with Frankenstein. And that's good. That's great stuff. That is, I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. That's great stuff. It's stuff like this that makes me come back to the film. I'm like, that was a genuinely great moment. And then, of course, he hears the police sirens and runs away, fright again, because Kumi Mizuno can't help him. But just being able to see her was enough to calm him down. That was cool stuff. I genuinely liked that. In the American version of the film, why I prefer the Japanese version. The American version of the film, when the police cars go chasing after Frankenstein retaliates and picks one of them up and throws it, and the car explodes. He does some damage in that scene. Honda did not like that, and this is another reason why I like Ishiro Honda. Ishiro Honda thought that Frankenstein, seeing Kumi Mizuno, would have calmed down and tried to run away. Just try to get out of there before causing any damage or causing any more of a scene. And there are all these people pointing at him, being like, there he is, and again, that just makes you feel sympathy for Frankenstein, because Frankenstein is an actual human. The Japanese version, Frankenstein just hides. And what happens is he's kind of cornered and he charges, but he just runs away. He doesn't do like any real significant damage whatsoever. And I prefer that, because I don't feel like Frankenstein would suddenly get really angry after seeing Kumi Mizuno and then kill people by throwing one of the cars and making it explode. I think that adding that in there ruins that moment. I think it ruined that moment. This is just the American version. Ruined that moment, kind of contradicted what just happened with Frankenstein, and kind of killed some of the sympathy we have for Frankenstein. All I can say is thank God for Honda, because Honda saved that sequence. He cut that out. Speaking of the American version, I don't know what is it with Americans and wanting to add in more sound effects for monsters. It's the worst example of this is in Godzilla Raids Again, aka Gigantic Fire Monster, where they replace Godzilla's roar with Anguirus roars, and he roars every 5 seconds. Kind of diminishes the point of his roar if you really look at it. In the Japanese version of Frankenstein Conquers the World, Frankenstein rarely makes noises. And a lot of that can be inferenced because of his isolation away from humanity, or being shunned by humans who see him, even when he was just a baby. In the version, they added in all these silly grunts. It sounded like a spoof version of a zombie. I was watching the American version on my TV, while I was doing some homework and studying, And every time Frankenstein was on screen, all of a sudden the American version added in this. I was laughing, and my roommate, who was on his laptop like he is now, right behind me, and he's watching his anime shit. I don't know what the fuck he's doing. Listening to his music, working on his scripts, because that's what he does, and he has no life. Right, Mark? Mm-hmm. Right. He stopped what he's doing and just laughed, because it sounded so fucking ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. The Japanese version is so much better because they made Frankenstein quieter, and I think that worked to Frankenstein's character's better advantage. It added another level of humanity to him that otherwise, you know, it's that kind of level of humanity with this character Frankenstein that makes this a better than normal film. And he's also, and what's sad about Frankenstein is that because they know he's on the loose, he's also blamed for the shit that Baragon does. Because Baragon, we'll get into Baragon a little later, but Baragon does a lot of shit, and he's blamed for it, and the JSDF is like, we gotta kill him. Kind of rightfully so. And the evidence was mounting up. I would also be like, let's kill Frankenstein. We kind of have to. Every time Frankenstein is seen with humans, he never does anything evil to them. He does nothing menacing, which is why I prefer the Japanese version again, because they cut out that scene where he's throwing the police car. Frankenstein is more curious about people than anything else, and I love that the guy who played him does very little things. Like, for example, when the children go into this cave, Frankenstein, they see Frankenstein, they kind of freak out. But you see Frankenstein, and when he hears them calling, when he hears them talking, Frankenstein just pops his head around a corner, and he's curious about them. And another reason why why I do come back to this movie. That's another good moment. The audio commentary for this film isn't very good, but it's done by Sadamasa Arakawa, and it's not very good. In fact, I'd say you can skip it. But he says something towards the end that really did strike me, and it's very true. Sadamasa Arakawa said, "He is not a monster, he is a human being." And it's shit like that, you know, him seeing the kids. I almost wish that there was more to that. You know, with Frankenstein seeing the kids and stuff. That really sells to me that this isn't just a giant monster in the loose. This really is a human being we're talking about here, that we're dealing with. Though he doesn't have the mental abilities of a human, even though, you know, he's clearly able to make fire and stuff like that. He's not evil, you know, he's not just a regular monster in the loose, monster of the week kind of thing. He is a general human being. And, you know, I almost wish they went more into that relationship with the children. I mean, the children just freak out and run away. But I wish what happened was, what if the children befriend him? What if the children become friends with him and they actually treat him good, just like Kumi Mizuno did? It would have made the scene that followed, where the JSDF find him and they shoot at him and stuff, way more tragic. The fact, like what if the JSDF go in there and they rip the kids out and then immediately start shooting at an attempt to kill Frankenstein? That would have been very sad. That would have been very tragic, and I wish they did something with that. It's not exactly a missed opportunity, because what's there is still good, because they still captured the curiosity of Frankenstein. Another example of his level of curiosity towards human and how he doesn't harm humans is the barge scene. There's a sequence where there's like a yacht going out in this lake and Frankenstein's in the water. And so Frankenstein pops up, of course crashes the party on this yacht, and everyone's freaking out. He's like, oh my god, he's going to sink the boat, oh my god, he's going to sink the boat. And what I like about that is that Frankenstein doesn't even like really touch the boat. He just like gets out of its way and just watches the people on it, because he's very curious. And the actor who plays Frankenstein again does a great job at portraying this level of curiosity, because he's very curious, and then he just goes back in the water and minds his own business. I love that. I do. I absolutely love moments like that. It's great stuff. Great stuff. He actually saves one of the scientists from being killed. You know, the scientist is being caught in this whole huge battle, and well, bam, he saves the guy and brings him back to the other scientists. Great stuff. Great stuff. And also, they used a puppet in that sequence. The puppet work in this film is really good. In fact, the effects in this film is really good, because the puppet matched the movement of the actor, actually. Like, all of a sudden, it would cut to the actor like lifting himself up, and then a rock would fall on him, and then it'd cut to the puppet, and the puppet falling down. It actually looks really good and actually really convincing. And a lot of that comes from the fact that these monsters aren't as tall as Godzilla and Rodan and King Ghidorah and stuff like that, so they could put more details into the miniatures. They could put more emphasis on detail. in like miniature buildings and so on and so forth. In fact, I might as well talk about the special effects right now, since that really is all I have to say about Frankenstein's character. The visual effects in this film are great. They are. They're really good, with a couple of misses. There are a couple things that are kind of really bad. And a lot of that comes out in that final battle sequence. That final battle sequence with the fight between Frankenstein and Baragon is fucking gorgeous, and there's so much energy, and there was so much, like, Frankenstein would be punching him, then all of a sudden Frankenstein gets on Baragon's back and starts punching his head there, and then he gets flipped off because Baragon raises up, and then immediately Frankenstein rolls on his back and then gets up and just goes right back in. It's great stuff. There's a lot of energy, and the cuts are great, the takes are great, and the music by Akira Ifukube is great. Everything is good about this film. And what I realized, it's also beautiful because what happens is one of the torches that Frankenstein kind of uses to kind of diverge Baragon and to also cook his own food lands in the trees and causes a forest fire. So while they're fighting, you have this red glow, right? This ominous red glow of the flames, as well as there's some great composite shots with Frankenstein like reaching up and roaring while the flames are rising up behind him, while the music is also swelling and being embellished. That is some gorgeous ass shit. It's so colorful and so beautiful. I'm like, wow, this is like one of the most beautiful fight scenes I've ever seen. Like, it's so good and colorful. I found that there was a lot of energy in this battle because Eiji Tsuburaya, when directing these battle sequences, was basically like, go to town. Because Haruo Nakajima plays Baragon. And actually, I like that too. We'll get into Baragon a little later, but Haruo Nakajima's performance as Baragon gave Baragon even a bit of character that it actually makes me kind of like Baragon as well. But we'll get into that later. But the fight scene is improvised. A lot of it was improvised, or just have fun. And so and the reason why they got away with that was because this fight didn't take place in the middle of a city, like a lot of battles in this time period did. This fight took place in the middle of a mountain range with a lot of trees. And so that's where a lot of the energy comes from, and that's where a lot of the improvised camera movements kind of come from as well. In a lot of fight scenes, the camera movements are very deliberate and very, very even, which there's nothing wrong with that, but in this film, the improvised movement of the camera, where the camera is just kind of like a part of the battle, and it's like moving, it doesn't quite know where it's going to go, so it's moving around a lot. And it's also shaky because someone was actually physically holding the TOHO scope camera, which were heavy pieces of machinery, by the way. And I will say it right now, this is what the end fight from King Kong vs. Godzilla should have been like. Because Frankenstein is fast as fuck and can think really quickly, while Baragon is nothing but like a giant-ass tank. Same thing goes with that. It goes with Godzilla and King Kong. In fact, I really based my fight in the first episode of the Godzilla saga, the first part of the Godzilla saga, Godzilla and King Kong, off of this fight and the end fight to War of the Gargantuas, because I'm like, this is what the fight should have been like. This is what the fight should have been. But I digress. There's only one effect in this film that I'm like, oh god, that was awful. Baragon shows up in this city, right, or in this farm, and eats all the chickens, and there's like feathers coming out of his mouth, which is kind of funny. But there's this horse that's like bouncing up and down, and it's a miniature horse, and I'm like, did you guys really fucking think that looked good? What I would have done was I would have gotten at least stock footage of a horse going, "Nurr!" And then I would have cut to the miniature of Frankenstein eating the fucking horse. Now, it's something interesting, because these monsters were smaller than Godzilla, and Ishiro Honda was so used to working with Godzilla, Honda specifically told Tsuburaya that he wanted a lot of scenes where the humans interact with Frankenstein or in the shots with the monsters or the effects. And Eiji Tsuburaya, instead of seeing a problem, instead of seeing, instead of seeing something different, this is why I love Eiji Tsuburaya. Eiji Tsuburaya was like, oh, let's have fun with this. And so that's exactly what happens. There is a lot of blue screen in this film. Some of the blue screen is better than others. But there is a lot of blue screen in this film, and the composite work for most of it looks really good, the level of detail. There's a couple of shots in particular that stand out. One of them is when Baragon makes his big, grand appearance and destroys a night party. There's this great shot where you have a miniature set in the background, and then you have all of these cars here and people running here, people getting in cars and cars driving off, and two huts here, while Baragon is destroying the shit in the background. That shot looked fucking amazing. Then there's another one, the sequence where Frankenstein sees the kids and is curious, and JSDF arrive and start shooting at them. Some of the best damn miniature work I've ever seen, or transition from live action stuff to miniatures I've ever fucking seen. The level of detail in that set was so gorgeous. Because what happens is you see the Japanese soldiers shooting, and then you hear Nick Adams like, get out of here, just get out of here, and freaking the fuck out. And you see the shadow come up on the back side of the wall, and the soldiers are running for their life while shooting. And so then it cuts to a reverse angle shot of the soldiers running outside and them clearly seeing something. Then cut to a miniature version of what was once live action, and Frankenstein walks onto the set. The only thing that gives away that this is a miniature is literally Frankenstein. That's the only thing. It looks that good. Praises to the art department. Praises to Agent Tsuburaya for making it look so fucking good and so fucking precise and detailed. And then the other one that comes to mind is only in the Japanese version of the film. You see, Baragon, Frankenstein wants to eat this boar, all right? And he builds a trap for the boar. But what happens is he hears tanks coming for him. And so a tank rolls into the trap for the boar, and the tank gets stuck. So a bunch of soldiers run up, right? And what's cool is that there are these miniature guys on the miniature tank moving around, these puppets, and they're interacting with the soldiers on the ground who are real soldiers. And they even gave one of them a line. One of the soldiers who was really there says, "Are you all right?" And one of the soldiers who is a miniature on the tank turns around and goes, and his arm raises, and it says, "We're okay." And I'm like, oh, that's hilarious. And then there's a shot where the boar charges at him. The boar was a puppet, right, that was charging at him. It actually looks pretty decent. It doesn't look seamless, don't get me wrong, but it looks pretty decent. Suddenly they're like, fuck a boar! And the boar charges towards them, and then it cuts to them like taking cover while the boar runs over them. Again, that was them composited into the shot with the miniatures. I'm like, that was some great fucking work. And it was also a comedic moment that made you kind of chuckle at the situation. So that was pretty good. On to Baragon. Alright, I'll be honest. Might as well just fucking say it. Baragon is the weakest part of the film. Sorry, guys. I'm really sorry. He is the weakest part of the... I love Baragon. I do. I love his design. I love his roar. Of course, his roar was a stock roar from Varan the Unbelievable, but I still love his roar. And obviously, Tsuburaya thought so too, because he reused the Baragon suit and refurbished it and just kind of remade it more than any other suit in the Toho lot. So obviously, he liked it too. And another thing, too, is that this is the only film I've seen Baragon in out of the three. And one of them, he was only in it for like 5 seconds. Where Baragon has like an atomic breath kind of thing, or like a fire effect come out of his mouth. That is clearly something left over from the Frankenstein vs. Godzilla script, and they just kind of left it in here. And instead they changed the effect from blue to red. And they were like, good enough. I honestly wish that wasn't there, because it literally almost serves nothing to the plot whatsoever, because it doesn't start the forest fire. If it started the forest fire, that'd be something, you know, or if they clearly explain, like, he uses it to dig or to melt the rocks to help him dig, but they don't. It's just there for the sake of being there, and Baragon is hit, and Frankenstein is hit with it, and it does nothing to Frankenstein, so it serves no purpose at all. And so I was like, I wish it was just gone. It serves no purpose at all. However, I do like how they explain why Baragon's horn glows. Because throughout the film, you see Baragon and his horn is glowing. And I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. They actually explain it, all right? They actually explain it. And it's because Baragon is digging in subterranean levels so much, he needs something to light his way. And his horn was created that way. They were actually inspired, and they say this in the movie, they were inspired by fish at the bottom of the ocean that have like the thing dangling in front of them, those terrifying looking fish that, you know, glow a certain color. It's like, that's cool. I was like, at least they explain it. Baragon is also carnivorous. This film has a lot to do with food. This film has a lot, like Frankenstein needs food and Baragon needs food. Unlike the Godzilla films where it's just like Godzilla shows up and destroys shit, this film they actually go into details that, you know, these giant monsters gotta eat. So Baragon is extremely carnivorous, and he's seen eating people. He's not seen eating people, but it's inference that he eats people throughout this film. And that is unlike Frankenstein. Frankenstein does not eat people. In fact, he shies away from them. Baragon flat out eats whatever's in his way. I kind of like that. It's kind of a prototype Zetus, almost. It felt like a prototype Zetus from Gamera the Brave. And, yeah, whatever. But here's why I don't like Baragon. I mean, I like his design, I like his roar, everything about him. He just looks cool. And again, I don't know, I love... Baragon fills up the frame. Every time Baragon is on screen, he just fills up the frame and has a presence. And that's because I think it was shot in TOHO scope. I forgot who said it, but somebody said that anamorphic widescreen was made for the man lying down. And it really is, because Baragon crawls on all fours like Varan. He fills up the screen and has a presence that otherwise, if he was on 2 feet, wouldn't have been there. Or would have been more difficult to pull off. And I like that a lot. But whatever. But I have the same problem with Baragon as I do with Varan. Why the hell is he here in this film? You're left asking, what revived this monster? Why is he suddenly attacking? Why is he suddenly here in Japan? And the only explanation that's there in my mind is an outside example, or an outside thought, which is he's only there to have a monster for Frankenstein to fight. And I'm like, that's a piss-poor excuse why a monster should be there. Why I like Godzilla vs. Mothra so much is because they explain why Mothra is there. Because the egg happens and Mothra needs to protect the egg. You know, that's some great stuff. And here, there's no fucking explanation as to why Baragon suddenly shows up and destroys an oil field. It just happens. Yeah. And another complaint that I have is, why the fuck, this is only in a Japanese version. The American version, they cut this line out. Why in the hell do the actors suddenly, out of nowhere, call him Baragon? And they only say his name once throughout the film. It was like, because the film was titled in Japan, Frankenstein versus Baragon, so it's like, oh shit, we forgot that we needed to name the monster. So Honda was like, one of you say Baragon when you're yelling. And so one of the actors was like, okay. And so they're like, quickly, get out of here, Baragon is coming. And that's the only line where it's in. I'm like, why? Why? Yeah, it would have been better. This is why I preferred the title Frankenstein Conquers the World, by the way, even though that title still makes no fucking sense, because Frankenstein doesn't conquer anything. I wish they didn't name him. I wish that, I mean, I guess they could name him for trademark's sake, but I wish they didn't name him in the film. They just said the monster. You know, I thought that would have worked better, but whatever. That's a nitpick. Let's talk about the ending of the film. Because there's 2 of them. There's 2 of them. And luckily on the out-of-print Tokyo Shock DVD, which is really good, by the way, they have both endings and you can choose which version you want to see. One ending is somewhat normal, though not by much. And the other includes a giant octopus. Yeah, a giant octopus. You heard right. And here's why. Andrew G. Saperstein fucking loved the octopus King Kong fight in King Kong vs. Godzilla. He was like, oh, I want that. And so this being his first time truly working with Toho and making a film, he basically went up to Honda and Kimura and being like, dude, I want a fucking octopus in this movie. So Honda was like, what? And Henry G. Saperstein was like, yeah, I want a fucking octopus. I want this movie to have an octopus. And Honda's like, that make no fucking literal sense in this film whatsoever. I mean, it's about Frankenstein fighting a fucking... Whatever. You're putting up the money for this film, we'll give you what you want. So Honda agreed, and so Eiji Tsuburaya went back in, and he shot a couple of additional scenes with Nick Adams and Kumi Mizuno and so on and so forth, of an octopus. And what happens is, right after Frankenstein kills Baragon, in a rather brutal way, by the way, suddenly he sees an octopus. And the octopus comes up out of nowhere, and Frankenstein fights the octopus. And it's really stupid. Because what happens is, it makes no logical sense at all why an octopus would travel all the way inland from the ocean, because this takes place in the Japanese heartland, quite frankly, quite a ways, almost directly in between the ocean and the other side of the ocean. They're in China, you know. It takes place very far inland. And why the fuck would an octopus travel all that way just to fight Frankenstein? Again, Honda was like, okay, why the fuck not? And so we get this, and it's so sad, because the effects of the movie are really good. The wire work, Again, you can tell Sadamasa Arikawa had something to do with it because there's a lot of wire works with the fucking tentacles and shit, and they're done really well. The fight scene's actually really, really interesting to watch. There actually looks like there's a lot of weight being pulled against Frankenstein. And it looks good, but it just makes no fucking sense at all. It's so random, too. It just comes out of fucking nowhere. And he was like, a giant octopus! And their faces are like the audience's faces. They're like, what? I gotta say this, too. What a horrible way for Frankenstein to die. To get dragged into a lake. First off, it's not the ocean, it's a lake, so the octopus would die anyways. Frankenstein gets pulled into a lake, drowns, and is to be eaten by an octopus. That's a horrible and undignified way to die. In my opinion, the other ending is better, but not by much. The other ending to the film, which is the one that's seen in the American version and the original Japanese version, is not that much better, but it's still better. So Frankenstein kills Baragon, and then is killed by an earthquake. Like, this random earthquake happens, and Frankenstein gets swallowed into the earth and dies. Now, the earthquake is also completely fucking random and out of fucking nowhere, but it's still slightly more believable than having a random giant fucking octopus come up out of nowhere to eat Baragon, to eat fucking Frankenstein. And also, some people could argue that the earthquake was caused by Baragon burrowing under the ground, in that they fought on top of a place where Baragon dug underground and it collapsed. But I don't think the filmmakers put that much emphasis in it. They just thought, well, we need to kill Frankenstein off, and so they're like, earthquake! And that's what happens. The octopus scene explains why Gyra is made, perhaps, because the octopus maybe dragged Frankenstein's corpse into the ocean. And that's why Gyra is made. And that would also explain why Gyra at the beginning of War of the Gargantuas is seen fighting that same giant octopus in War of the Gargantuas. By the way, War of the Gargantuas is a sequel, in case I haven't said that right now. I don't know which ending I like better, because one ending explains War of the Gargantua a little better, but one ending fits more with Frankenstein's demise and stuff. Both endings are flawed. Both endings, either him getting swallowed up by the octopus or him being swallowed up by the earth itself. Both endings feel like they were just slapped on there because they just ran out of ideas. They're like, oh fuck, we gotta end this movie. How are we gonna end this movie? So that's a problem. That's a pretty big damn problem. So now we also have the human characters. The human characters are kind of boring, but their performances are good, if that makes any sense at all. We have Nick Adams. Nick Adams is a standard scientist. His character is basically a standard scientist caught in between two extremes. You have Kumi Mizuno, who is like, save the boy. Save Frankenstein completely. And what her problem is, Kumi Mizuno is all heart, but no brain. And then we have the other guy, who is played by the guy from King Kong vs. Godzilla, and normally plays in comedic roles, and actually is playing a serious role in this one. The other guy is all brain and no heart. So Nick Adams plays the middleman. And there's a great line where he says that, too. It's for Nick Adams, when they hear that Frankenstein escaped for the first time, Kumi Mizuno is like, let me go, I can speak to him. And he pins her against the wall and says, well, she says the line, he's only a boy, and Nick Adams screams, he's no longer only a boy. It's a great performance. Nick Adams gives a really, really great performance in this film. And he does an Invasion of the Astro Monster, too. It's full of character, it's full of life. It's actually pretty well done. What I liked about this is because Nick Adams cares about his work. Clearly, Nick Adams' character cares about his work. He's first seen, in fact, the first scene he's in is actually my favorite scene with him, to be completely honest. And so he's working with radiation. He's studying radiation, he's studying the effects of cancer and so on and so forth. He's a radiologist, I think that's what they call him. Anyways, and he's working at Hiroshima Scientific Station. And so what happens is there's a scene where he goes to this girl who is suffering from cancer. Clearly it's cancer. They never specifically say it's cancer, but clearly it is. And what happened was that she's only like 20-something years old, and what is explained in some dialogue that happens after this scene, that her mother was pregnant when the bomb was dropped, and so the womb was irradiated, and so it gave her cancer. It gave this little girl cancer, and it's a very sad scene, but yet sweet at the same time. It's bittersweet, I guess is the only way to call it. And it reminds me of, there's this book that I read called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, which is a beautiful book. I know it's kind of a children's book, but it's a beautiful book, and I suggest reading it. It's very short, if you ever get a chance, but read it. but it's still a very touching scene, because what she does is this girl knows she's gonna die, right? And she gives Nick Adams a pillow and this thing that she sewed herself. And it's very sad because Nick Adams is like, she knows her time is up, but yet he's very nice to her. She's like, thank you very much. And this is why another reason why I love Honda, and why I think he's also the king of subtlety as well as the king of allegory. If you notice the scenes that take place in their office, the scenes that take place in the scientific office, that pillow that she gave him is always there. It is. It's such a minor thing. It's something you can easily glance over and never even notice. But I only noticed it when I was watching the American cut of the film. It's still there in a corner on the couch. It's still there in the corner, not on the couch, on the chair. And I'm like, wow. That was clearly Honda's doing. I was like, wow, that's a great touching moment. And what's interesting is that at first he really did not want to be in these movies at all. He was like, oh God, but I need the money. And so he went over to do it. Because before this, he was actually like the leading role in a movie called Die Monster Die, made the same year as Frankenstein Conquers the World and Invasion of the Astro Monster. So he made 3 movies this year. Made a movie in England called Die Monster Die, starring Boris Karloff. And he was very much featured in that film. So he was like, why do I want to make a cheap science fiction movie when I was just in this really gothic, really good horror film made in England? So he comes over to Japan very skeptical, and then he started working with Honda. And it turned out that he fucking loved working with Honda. He loved how Honda directed. He loved how Honda understood him. He loved how Honda worked, and he loved the amount... I think he loved the attention he was getting, because he was like, wow, here's a Hollywood actor working with us. I think he loved the attention. And so, because of that, he wound up enjoying not only being in this film, but also being in Invasion of the Astro Monsters. And it's a cool story. It's cool to see how suddenly he went from being, ugh, why the fuck do I want to be in this? And to suddenly being like, oh, this is really cool. I'm actually really enjoying myself here. Also, the actors just absolutely loved him. They called him literally, I think Kumi Mizuno said this herself. She described him as a bundle of joy. And I was like, wow. He clearly wound up putting a lot of effort into this film and clearly enjoyed being in these films when you watch them. And I was like, wow, that's cool right there. Now, Nick Adams is actually a sad story. I actually want to talk about his story a little bit. Nick Adams is a sad example of how horrible Hollywood can be. He was basically a young actor who peaked too early. He was even Oscar nominated. He was a good actor. He was in a very successful TV show, The Rebel, Die Monster Die, for example. He was in some great stuff, and he got Oscar nominated, but he lost, which is unfortunate. But what happened was Nick Adams took a lot of drugs and alcohol to basically keep him moving during times between films, because sometimes there'd be almost like a year in between before he could get another role, and he would take a lot of drugs to get him through it. And basically that started taking a very huge mental toll on him. And above that, he was also accused of being a homosexual. And in the 1960s, that was taboo. You could not fucking work. If you were gay, you couldn't work in Hollywood. And he had a wife. Nick Adams had a wife, but he was still accused of being a homosexual. And so that also hurt his career immensely, and this was after he was nominated. And it made it almost impossible for him to find a job. And unfortunately what happened is he was found dead of a suicide. And I think he was only like 32, something like that, a very young actor. He was a great actor who left the scene way too early, and I wished he was in more. So I hope he rests in peace, blah, 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 but he was a very sad story. Now, on a lighter note, let's talk about Mizuno. Kumi Mizuno. I think her character, because she reprises this role in War of the Gargantuas, I think she's handled way better in War of the Gargantuas, just want to say right now. She's still comes off pretty good in this. She's a bit preachy in this film. She's way too preachy for my liking. And she's approached as kind of being blind to the reality of the situation. But I can tell she genuinely cares about Frankenstein. Her acting is still very good. Her dialogue could have used some work, but her acting was still there. And again, she's all heart but no logic. So on and so forth. The other doctor was played by the guy who plays him. It's actually a serious role. He played the photographer guy who is also the drummer in King Kong vs. Godzilla, and he's actually playing a serious role here. This guy's all logic and no heart, and he wants to tear Frankenstein apart to prove that he is Frankenstein. He wants to cut off one of his hands to see if it still is living. If it's still living, then we're talking about Frankenstein here. And so he wants to experiment with Frankenstein despite the consequences of killing a life. You know, he doesn't see Frankenstein as a human being. He sees Frankenstein, ironic that Frankenstein saves him, but he sees Frankenstein as an experiment piece. He's not afraid to tear Frankenstein apart to get what he wants. And it's a nice touch by both Kimura and Honda that the scene where he was going to amputate Frankenstein's arm to see if it's still living, in order for him to do it, the scientist guy has to get drunk to do it. The guy, he's taking drinks to do it. That's a nice touch, because again, that also sells home the point that Frankenstein, despite being this kind of deformed monster, is still a human being. Nice little touch there. So he just wants to experiment with Frankenstein despite, killing a human life. For example, he brings dynamite to kill Frankenstein, because they know that if Kumi Mizuno is yelling for him, he will probably come. So he brings dynamite to kill Frankenstein. He's like, "Look, I have dynamite!" And in a completely stupid move, he's like, I guess for some reason, showing Nick Adams and Mizuno that he has dynamite doesn't prove that he has dynamite, so he has to throw it and blow it up. And so this actor, this scientist, brings about the end of the movie. Because if he didn't throw that stick of dynamite and had it blow up to prove that he was holding dynamite, what the fuck? Baragon wouldn't have been woken up and wouldn't have attacked, and then Frankenstein wouldn't have come to intervene. So the entire ending of this movie wouldn't have happened if he didn't throw that stick of dynamite. So it's kind of artificial tension, and I'm like, no, go away. This is the last thing I have to talk about, I swear, and then I'll shut the fuck up. Is the music score by Akira Ifukube is fucking great. I never used to be a fan of the score until recently, and that was because of the Fantasia work that was released recently, and I fell in love with it. And the reason why I love the score mainly is because of Baragon's theme. Baragon's theme, seriously, listen to it. Baragon's theme is so fucking brooding. It's so brutal. It's great. I love it. And so dark. In fact, the entire score of this film is very dark and brooding and does set a very gothic kind of tone for this film. And it manages to create an atmosphere that Akira Ifukube really excels at, especially in films like Rodan. This is another example of his score being pretty damn dark. And this also establishes Frankenstein's theme that will also be perfected in War of the Gargantuas. He basically took a lot of the cues from this movie, because War of the Gargantuas is a sequel, and kind of perfected them, in my opinion, in War of the Gargantuas. But I love how he managed to make Frankenstein's theme very tragic, but yet at the same time very heroic towards the end of the film. This is why I love him. He was able to mesh these two things together very well. And so the music score is very good. So in the end, this is a film that has a lot of fucking problems. It has a lot of silly stuff that you have to sit through, but yet there's some really good stuff in there that really makes us kind of stand above the normal science fiction film. So I was going to give this film 2.5, but I found myself, I'm very much so on the edge. Like, a part of me feels like that if I watch this film 2 months from now, I'd probably give it 2.5. But then if I watched it 2 months after that, I'd be like 3 stars. So I'm going to give this film the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to say that this film has 3 out of 4. I give this film 3 out of 4 stars. Just barely 3 out of 4, but yeah, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. So I'll shut up, but not before I pimp myself out. Go on Facebook, like AN Productions, like my new movie, Which Way They Walk, which we're getting very close to some big film shoots, so wish us luck there. And if you wish, join Geeks for Geeks, our Facebook group, where we have a lot of interesting conversations, and yeah, it's great. You can promote your stuff there. Feel free to promote your stuff there if you have stuff that you want to show, like movies and so on and so forth. Feel free to promote them, to throw your stuff on there. We love that shit. Go ahead and join the group. It's a lot of fun. And hit the like button, hit subscribe, leave a comment. Tell me what you think of this film. I would love to hear them. I'd love to read them. And this is Adam Noyce of AN Productions saying, sayonara.